Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, well, we are recording, so don't say anything libelous.
Okay. Okay, so welcome everyone to our first meeting, our first seminar in contemporary Marxist theory of this new year and new decade, actually. We are very glad to have Paul Apostolidis here, who is a political theorist working in the politics department at LSE. And his works brings together critical theory and empirical field work with migrant workers in the United States. His talk today is entitled Racialized Precarity and the Coordinates of Class, Time, Technology, and Working Bodies. Paul will talk for about 40 minutes, and then as usual, we'll have our discussion. If you don't want the discussion to be recorded or live streamed, please send me a private message and we won't do it. Paul, do you want to start? Thank you very much for being here this evening. And if you want to start and share your screen, please go ahead.
Thanks everyone for being here today. It's a pleasure to be here to talk with you. This paper argues for the political and the critical value of reconceptualizing class today through the lens of precarity. The conjuncture of multiple circumstances makes this an opportune time to reconsider the notion of class and to assess the future of class-based political organizing. In the realm of electoral politics, recent times have witnessed resurgences, but also rebuffs. There we go, of the democratic socialist left in the US and the UK, along with the growth of right-wing populisms, class and racial diversity in these countries. These events have followed on the heels of the dramatic rise, but then the taming and defeat of class-focused anti-austerity movements in Europe, such as in Spain and Greece. In contentious politics on the streets, after the massive multiracial anti-racist mobilizations for Black lives in the US and in the UK, some have suggested that anti-racist politics offers a new center of gravity for the most radical forms of anti-system activism today. And yet, not long ago, the common wisdom was that a new class struggle had been kindled by the 2008 financial crisis with the Occupy events and the movements of the squares. The pandemic has had mixed and unclear implications for all these trends. On the one hand, COVID-19 has aggravated class divisions and exposed their lethal implications for subordinate groups. News reports since spring 2020 have documented the abrupt descent of millions into poverty and hunger, and the correlations of lower socioeconomic status with higher rates of infection and death. The labor-based sources of these disparities also have been noted, including low-income individuals' need to work dangerous jobs because of inadequate public relief, and the risky conditions of labor in meatpacking plants, hospitals, and service gig jobs. The cynical ambivalence in the UK government's advice to work from home if you can encapsulates this basic class divide wrought by the coronavirus. Some can, some can't, and the sharp parting of fates is plain for all to see. Accordingly, some journalists and activist leaders on the progressive left have seized on this moment to declare that a new, quote, class war has broken out. So The Nation used this sensationalist rhetoric to frame an article about labor protests that erupted last spring in the United States among auto workers, bus drivers, and other groups, with the spread of the coronavirus in so many workplaces. And then last May, the National Day Labor Organizing Network in the US released COVID-19 workplace health and safety guides for people whom the network provocatively termed not essential workers, but the essential working class. At the same time, COVID-19 has renewed prospects for progressive and radical politics that decenter class. So racial and ethnic disparities and exposure to the virus's effects have been just as strongly thematized in the public realm as class differences, perhaps more so. And it is also remarkable how rapidly neoliberal regimes have authorized enormous state expenditures to bolster ailing economies after decades of insisting upon welfare state contraction and privatization as the only routes to prosperity and social stability. And these responses would seem to demonstrate that class transcending general solidarity in favor of welfarist solutions to societal problems is still conceivable, and thus that now maybe is not the right time to underscore and politicize class antagonisms. And then in various circles of left theory, for years now, writers have proposed a series of successors to the proletariat as the collective subject of radical historical transformation in the late modern era. So for Jodi Dean, for example, the radical protagonist arising in the new era of what she calls communicative capitalism is the knowledge class. And Dean writes that she defines this category very broadly to designate those whose communicative activities generate value that is expropriated from them. And she continues, I have in mind both the wide field of knowledge labor and the voluntary, unpaid, everyday activities of media users that are traced, stored, aggregated, and analyzed as a proprietary resource for capitalist accumulation. Mackenzie Work takes a similar line of thought further. According to Work, the quote vectoralist class and the hacker class now confront one another in a struggle for control over information, which ostensibly has replaced the struggle over labor's conscription into the accumulation of capital as the fundamental social cleavage. And Guy Standing, in turn, contends that today's most dangerous class, as he puts it, is not the proletariat, knowledge-based or otherwise, but rather the precariat. He understands this collectivity as composed of multiple social groups, including the elderly, the young, migrants, who share a common exposure to labor-related insecurity and an affective milieu of anger, anomie, anxiety, and alienation. And for many years, of course, other schools of radical thought have rejected or downgraded the idea of retaining class as a privileged axis of social analysis and political struggle. So I'm thinking here of latter-day autonomists such as Hardin Negri with their conception of the multitude, also Sandro Mezzadra and Brett Nielsen, who celebrate heterogeneity and multiplicity of popular movements as the best hope for opposing capitalist extraction, logistics, and finance. Or consider Chantal Mouffe's latest reformulation of post-Marxist thinking in her call for a left populism anchored in a discourse of radical democracy. Much left theory today thus insists that our conceptions of class need critical revitalization and gropes for new pathways of critique that respond to epochal upheavals in the organization of work, the onset of mass precarity, and the ever-intensifying associations between white supremacy and capitalist power. Largely lacking, however, has been a certain type of inquiry that I believe could orient the search for alternatives more ably. What I have in mind are examinations of labor processes and work cultures in the precaritized, information-driven economy that evaluate the political implications of work's hallmark features today. Such analyses, I think, should keep several priorities in the forefront. So first, they should avoid fetishizing digital labor and knowledge work as decisively determining the social basis of radical political action. I find Dean's critique of communicative capitalism to be insightful, especially her argument that online social networking promotes capital's enrichment, undermines critical deliberative capacities, and fosters defensive modes of identity politics. And it's also vital to gauge the social and political effects from the expansion of users' free labor on the internet. And yet, we live neither in a post-industrial economy nor work in a post-capitalist world. Laptops and fiber optic networks need to be built and maintained. Machine operators and code writers need to be clothed, fed, and housed. And political organizing among migrant, non-white, and global South workers has shown great promise worldwide, even when neither their labor nor their politicization is premised on producing exploitable knowledge. Too often, moreover, it seems to me that the thesis of the knowledge class uncritically assumes that exploitation as such lies at the root of radical political motivation. The assumption seems to be that if we identify the form of labor in production that is being most intensively exploited today, then we will know who the revolutionary collective subject is. Rather, I would argue that we need to investigate how information, knowledge, and human bodies interact through labor in a broader and more open sense. So we need to examine, for example, not just how people produce knowledge that capital appropriates, but also how information technologies act on working bodies in the midst of production, steering their activities while gathering information about them. And we also must take into account the abiding and expanding forms of labor in the precaritized economy that involve very little contact with advanced technologies. Decentering the problem of exploitation thus would make it possible to discern more clearly what labor-based experiences might move people to want political transformation. So what we need are fine-grained analyses of cultures of work to illuminate historically specific dynamics, especially racial dynamics, that constitute certain kinds of working subjects with distinctive desires and material circumstances. Inquiries into the politics of labor processes also should seek to theorize the blend of unifying and differentiating tendencies for workers that contemporary capitalism involves. And symmetrically, I would argue that such analyses should develop a political vision that is elastic enough to encompass forms of mobilization based on group difference, as well as those found in mass solidarity. So in other words, by proposing granular examinations of how distinctive types of subjects are formed through work processes, I'm not simply urging the recognition and politicization of group differences. I am advocating for forms of critique that do this while simultaneously searching for general dynamics of domination in working life. If we look for ways that patterns of subject formation through labor and work environments not only foster group specificities, but also structure the experiences of large populations, then we can imagine left initiatives that are more substantial than the many standard calls for building coalitions among differently situated groups, a demand that is essential, but also obvious and insufficient. In addition, analyzing the politics of work processes should involve sustained critical dialogue with members of subaltern groups in an effort to encounter subaltern languages of suffering and struggle. In part, convergences between academic theory and vernacular expressions are needed to sharpen understanding of how racial capitalist domination operates in the lives of ordinary working people. And yet, these investigations also should not hypothesize such languages as only articulating certain groups' experiences. Theorists also should listen to any such lexicon for the ways that it puts words on broadly shared social circumstances, words that could help members of other groups become more critically aware of their own predicaments and their own needs for a different society. So my research has focused on developing various pathways for reinvigorating critical theory through these kinds of intellectual reciprocities with Latino migrants' accounts of their work lives and political struggles in the United States. So in a previous project, I analyzed meatpacking workers' stories of migrating illegally from Mexico, working in the United States' most dangerous industry, and organizing a rank and file led union campaign against Tyson Foods, which is the world's largest fresh meat producer. That project approached workers' narratives as forms of Gramscian common sense that unlocked new meanings of racial biopolitics as it operates in the food production and the border control systems. And then more recently, I've been pursuing an engagement between critical theory and migrant day laborers' intellectual culture of popular education. So I'm referring here to the vision of popular education classically articulated by the Brazilian political philosopher Paulo Freire and practiced by popular movements in many parts of the Americas. And that includes the US, where the leaders of day labor organizations migrated often after they participated in revolutionary Central American movements in the 1980s, which were inspired by Freirean principles and practices. So my recent book, The Fight for Time, develops a new account of socioeconomic precarity by examining what Freire terms the generative themes in day laborers' commentaries on their difficult work lives, and then juxtaposes these clusters of popular language with critical theoretical conceptions of precarity on the broad social scale. So I call this approach critical popular analysis. And I see it as an effective way to meet all three of the key challenges that I just was discussing. So first, to explore how working subjectivities are constituted through racialized work processes according to specific schemas and with patterned political inclinations. Second, to theorize social domination at once on the levels of the general and the particular. And third, to enliven critical theory with popular discourse and vice versa, in this way heightening theory's political consequentiality. My main argument here today, in turn, is that conceiving of precarity in ways aided by migrant workers' generative themes opens up new vistas for seeing how class distinction and domination function in specific ways today. Now, these operations of class, I'll argue, are deeply inscribed by race, and they manifest in interactions among time, technology, and the body in processes of labor. And as I'll now discuss, the constitution of working class experience through racialized precarity can be modeled provisionally by looking at three forms of labor that are central to today's economy: day labor, warehouse work, and meatpacking. Okay, so first let's consider the patterns of embodied time that form in the world of migrant day labor. So day laborers, as many of you probably know, are individuals who seek extremely temporary jobs by standing out on street corners or hovering around the parking lots of big box construction stores like Home Depot, or going to worker centers that operate as hiring sites. And even though day laborers are constantly hunting for jobs, they usually only work 2 or 3 days a week on average. They earn very low wages doing yard work, construction, and moving jobs, and they're very poor. When we interviewed the workers, we found that half of them were homeless and many had trouble getting enough to eat. In the US, about 3/4 of day laborers are undocumented migrants. About 90% are from Latin America, mostly Mexico and Central America. And almost all US day laborers are men, although migrant women domestic workers increasingly get jobs through day labor centers and recently have assumed key leadership roles in the day labor network. So my assistants and I conducted nearly 80 semi-structured interviews with individual day laborers at the 2 main worker centers in the US Pacific Northwest. And so one is called Casa Latina, it's in Seattle, and the other is the MLK Junior Day Labor Center in Portland, which is run by the VOS Worker Rights and Education Project. And we supplemented the interviews with about 300 hours of participant observation. And that mostly involved volunteering by taking employer calls and doing job dispatch at Casa Latina and teaching English at VOS. So the main point again was to identify these Freirean generative themes in the ways that workers characterize their experiences of work. So now in the interviews, the workers described what it was like to be constantly on the move looking for jobs and shifting between jobs, but also to be frozen day after day in a kind of paralysis as they waited for the lottery results at Casa Latina or the MLK Center, which usually were discouraging. So when they talked about these experiences, the word that we heard most often was the term desperation. We asked one participant why more workers did not come to skills training classes when they had no luck in the job lottery. And he replied, it's that sometimes people get desperate because they aren't working, because sometimes there's work and sometimes there's not. Another worker explained how desperation felt internally, why it drained his motivation to attend English classes, even when he had no job. He said, how can I put it? It's the worries. I think that if I had a job where I worked until the evening, I'd get organized enough to study. My mind doesn't rest. I'm worried thinking about it, so my head doesn't let me rest. As these comments illustrate, the workers' sense of desperation had a lot to do with their everyday experiences of time, and these were often contradictory. So on the one hand, things were always changing for these day laborers in unpredictable ways. Time flows in everyday life were riddled with discontinuities. Each new day labor job brought material conditions and employer demands that were different and hard to foresee, especially in terms of the pace of work. The random stop and start timing of jobs, along with the lottery's uncertainty, aggravated the feeling that the workers had that they never knew what would happen next. And wage theft is also a severe problem in day labor. Employers cheat workers of their wages in all kinds of ways, such as by arbitrarily changing the wage rate or switching the job to a more skilled task that should be more generously paid, or simply not paying the worker at all. And wage theft further compounded the instability of time in daily life because workers never could be sure how much their labor time would end up being worth. So on the other hand, and paradoxically, time also flowed with a relentless and oppressive continuity for the workers. They were perpetually anxious about never having enough work, never earning enough money, never knowing how long they would have a place to sleep and enough food to eat. And they were always bracing themselves to stave off such personal catastrophes by working at any job, at any wage that they could get. So we asked one worker what he most wanted, and he answered without a pause, just work. Working, wherever it may be, it doesn't matter where. If you don't work, there's no money, there's no food, there's no house, there's no nothing if you don't work. And yet, despite the degree to which these day laborers felt powerless and at the mercy of fate, it was remarkable how often they also affirmed an ethic of personal responsibility. That was another term that resounded throughout these interviews. And they said that they sought to be responsible by working efficiently and productively, that is, by striving to use their time on the job wisely. So many contrasted good workers who acted this way with bad workers who were lazy, who drank, and who let employers down. Like one worker who said, I've gone to work with people who just want to sit there talking. If the employers tell you it's a 6-hour job, they want to do it in 12. And these workers insisted that it was important to always give it their best and to visibly demonstrate this stout work ethic to their employers. And so there was a jarring misfit between workers' hopeless sense that they could exercise no independent control over their lives and their stalwart embrace of personal responsibility. Exercising such responsibility implied a level of autonomy to make prudent choices that desperate circumstances, by the workers' own accounts, precluded. The generative theme here, in other words, is the paradoxical composite notion of desperate responsibility. And the competing tugs between responsibility and desperation were especially acute when the workers talked about occupational safety and health hazards. And their language in discussing these workplace dangers extended the theme of desperate responsibility, giving it distinctly bodily dimensions. Workers stressed that day labor unavoidably involved facing risk on all sides, as one put it, but that one could tame the uncertainty by resolutely keeping, quote, eyes wide open. Again, a temporal dilemma defines this thematic pairing. So on the one hand, workers felt continuously compelled to stay vigilant for bodily threats as job sites, employers, work sites, and equipment perpetually shifted. On the other hand, all these changes irregularly disrupted work's time flows, as did unpredictable trauma events of bodily injury. Workers sought to mitigate this contradiction by invoking an ethic of personal responsibility, which was premised on keeping, quote, eyes wide open, as this quotation demonstrates here. Keeping your eyes open for emergent dangers and staying committed to the value of self-protection. And so in this way, keeping safe on the job served as another criterion by which day laborers differentiated morally between good and bad workers. And yet most of the workers admitted that they commonly violated their own ethical resolve because either they couldn't resist employers' pressures to work dangerously, or their work conditions simply fluctuated too wildly and too frequently. So in my book, The Fight for Time, the next step is to shift the critique's perspective from this microscopic view of day labor to the broad societal level. And the argument goes like this. To be sure, the theme of desperate responsibility signals a kind of precarity that applies exceptionally to day laborers and to other highly vulnerable migrants. This precarity assumes an especially cruel shape because of where these people are in the job market. They work in the crisis-prone residential construction sector, mostly in the US. But they are also racially targeted by the Homeland Security state and its deportation forces. And yet the syndrome of desperate responsibility also increasingly operates throughout society, throughout the economy. Working people at virtually all rungs of the occupational status ladder experience the temporally and physically inflected modes of precaritization that day laborers so evocatively name. So I consult various interventions in critical theory, especially in autonomous Marxism, to discuss the ways that the contradiction between work that never stops and work that never lasts pervades the employment economy. This has occurred through the combined effects of work's digitization, work's dematerialization, work's casualization, and work's professionalization in the sense of what Kathy Weeks calls the post-industrial work ethic. And likewise, the bodily aspect of this temporal conundrum extends throughout the working world, subjecting working people whose jobs are not considered physically hazardous to rising health threats. Especially of note in this regard are respiratory problems due to more and more work being performed indoors, muscle and skeletal maladies due to poor ergonomics, and cardiac and mental health illnesses that are traceable to the stress of downsizing, job insecurity, and perpetual assessment. And the same force conjunction, too, between desperation and personal responsibility also pervades the workforce, whether you're talking about the blue, the pink, or the white collar realms. In short, as Albena Osmanova puts it in her recent book, Capitalism on Edge, what we are witnessing today is the generalization of the state of precarity beyond the remit of insecure, meaningless, and poorly paid jobs, beyond groups lacking material welfare and suffering social exclusion. And I would specify, in addition, that this generalizing dynamic is evident above all in syndromes of contradictory, disabling, and exhausting embodied time. Politically, then, the question is how to envision and activate demands for alternatives to precarity capitalism by the working population as a whole. And here is where the concept of class can be of crucial help if we connect it to contemporary dynamics of precarity and thereby draw attention to racialized, class-differentiated permutations of generalized precarity. In this way, we can theorize a mid-range of social collectivity that is broader than the exceptional group, like migrant day laborers, but less total than the general working population. A collectivity that is defined by shared yet distinctive broad contours of work experience, and that on that basis could build political solidarity. The conquest of generalized precarity, in other words, hinges neither simply on coalition building among disparate groups, nor on a coming together of universalist demands for massive change. Rather, it depends on class struggle, understood with reference to a modulated conception of class in the age of racialized precarity. We can develop some hypotheses about how racialized precarity defines working class experience by comparing day labor to two other occupations that are central to the US and the global economies, and that in the United States depend on non-white, especially Latinx workers, meatpacking and warehouse labor. Workers in both of these industries are subject to contradictions of embodied time that tightly parallel those described by day laborers. So consider first meatpacking workers in super tailorized mega meat factories, like the gigantic Tyson Foods beef plant that I studied in the Pacific Northwest. So for these workers, over 90% of whom are Mexican, the contradictions manifest in the clash between the monotony of making the same cut through the same bodily motions minute after minute, day after day for months on end, on the one hand, and the chaos on the factory floor as injuries erupt and workers are abruptly reassigned to vacant jobs for which they have no training, on the other hand. Warehouse workers in California's Inland Empire, which is east of Los Angeles, also labor on an as-needed 0 hours basis. And so they are caught between the constant pressure of always needing to be ready to work while never knowing when they'll be beckoned, and sudden springs into action to unload and reload containers for the big retailers' just-in-time distribution. Another prominent common feature among all these occupations is bodily endangerment and debilitation. The best official estimates for day labor and meatpacking place the rate at about 1 in 4 workers suffering a serious injury in any given year, and the actual rates are likely far higher. In terms of workers' temporal experiences, the result is the normalization of constant bodily pain and relentless anxiety about getting injured or falling ill, coupled with abrupt outbreaks of trauma when injuries actually occur. Warehouse work is rife with similar conditions. Arduous physical work done at a frantic but erratic pace, demanding awkward bodily movements for workers whose temporary contracts allow no regular medical care and sometimes block access to urgent care when they get hurt. Still, another decisive component of temporalized bodily experience is the way all these jobs are situated in zones of rampant ecological damage and climate crisis. Not only does the labor process expose workers' bodies to the cruel interplay between traumatic injury events and long-term debilitation, in addition, the surrounding physical environment generates endemic health problems for the population at large. In the sparsely populated rural eastern Washington State county, where Tyson's beef factory is nestled amid endless acres of wheat fields and vineyards, Tyson's cattle feedlots and slaughterhouse generate the worst air quality in the state, apart from traffic-choked Seattle and Tacoma. California's Inland Empire is home to the fastest growing and the largest Latinx population in the United States in recent years. And air pollution there has ballooned with the warehouse industry's expansion in tandem with the growth of retail behemoths like Amazon, as enormous fleets of trucks release massive quantities of carcinogenic fumes around the clock. Day laborers, in turn, are typically called on as emergency, quote unquote, second responders when climate catastrophes happen. So, for example, during Hurricane Sandy in New York City and Hurricane Harvey in Houston, day laborers plunged into flooded streets amid broken sewers and downed power lines. They cleared the wreckage and began reconstructing neighborhoods, putting their own health gravely at risk. So these then are the common coordinates of working class precarity today. Precarity is structured in temporal contradiction as the collision in everyday work life between oppressive continuities of time and bewildering shock-like temporal discontinuities. And this temporalized precarity is registered in the body, in perpetual vulnerability to unpredictable incidents of corporeal damage, disfigurement, and death, both within the labor process and in the working community's ecological environs. And working class precarity is also racialized through and through by virtue of the complementary operations of private capital and the racial state. These operations of racial capitalism, in turn, are multifaceted and well integrated. So the militarization of the US-Mexico border, the criminalization of undocumented migrants by the state, supported by the civil society components of what Alfonso Gonzalez terms the anti-migrant hegemonic bloc. All these forces channel Latinx migrants into the lowest paid, least secure, and most dangerous occupations, like day labor, warehouse work, and meatpacking. Companies' recruitment practices further institutionalize the sorting of brown and black bodies into these kinds of work. So overall, the process promotes the physical, social, and political well-being of the white population by heightening risk in all these dimensions for Latinx groups and other communities of color in a labor-based version of the biopolitical schema theorized by Foucault. Land use and development policies with neoliberal logics are also crucial features of the state's racialization of precarity. Such policies concentrate Latinx populations in the shadows and amid the fumes of the vast sprawl of Inland Empire warehouses. Zoning laws and flood prevention policies help explain why the least white urban neighborhoods suffer the worst damage from climate disasters, while austerity cuts to public services heighten the need to rely on migrant volunteer and sub-minimum wage workers like day laborers when disaster strikes. And state authorities have allowed meat producers to relocate their factories from large cities to rural areas where unions are scarce, migrants are isolated from activist networks, and the abuse of workers and the environment can proceed unimpeded. Cultural narratives comprise still another crucial aspect of working class precarity's racialization. Think of the real estate industry's fantasy of the ranch lands beyond Los Angeles as an idol of white suburban life, fueling animosity towards migrants who staff the warehouses, now blighting the landscape, and who repopulate Inland Empire neighborhoods. Or think of America's veneration of eating beef as expressing a whiteness-inflected ideal of family, faith, and success. Or consider the historically white ideals of home ownership and home improvement, now structurally dependent on the drywalling, the moving, and the gardening performed by brown day laborers. So this is the last part of my talk. I'd like to conclude by reflecting on the role of technology in the image of racialized working class precarity that I've just sketched. So up to this point, I've focused on common patterns of time, body, and race in the three occupations I've examined. But technology intervenes in embodied time in curiously distinct ways in these different scenes of labor. So workers in Inland Empire warehouses have their most minute bodily motions observed and governed at all times by machines, by algorithms. As labor researcher Juan de Lara discusses, big companies like Walmart have digitized their warehouse operations. He says, new logistics technologies let companies track individual worker production by allowing them to measure the total number of boxes that each employee moves from one place to another. And de Lara quotes an immigrant warehouse worker named Jose, who explains how management controls workers' bodies and optimizes their productivity through these technologies. He reports, well, they really don't tell us nothing because we have a computer that tells us what to do. And right there, they can see through the computer who's moving fast and who's not. The companies can do this because computerized systems monitor Jose's and other workers' bodies in real time, continually collecting and processing information about where the body is located, where the goods are located, and in this way, enabling constant analysis of how quickly and how efficiently each worker is moving. And de Lara also emphasizes that data harvesting technology isn't just applied to the worker's body, it's also placed and carried on the worker's body, as this image of the body-worn scanner of barcodes, which are all over the physical objects inside warehouses, shows. In a sense, de Lara argues, data gathering technology even becomes the worker's body, or merges with the body such that warehouse workers become what he calls modern logistics cyborgs. Moreover, in what we might see as a dystopic manifestation of what autonomists call the general intellect, the logistical system integrates the physical motions of warehouse workers with real-time monitoring of inventory levels in Walmart superstores, hundreds or thousands of miles away. So as soon as barcode scanning shows that the stocks of certain goods are getting low in the store, that information immediately goes out through the network to devices in the warehouse, guiding the worker's body to move particular goods to the right shipping containers. So in the warehouses then, digital technology produces the following effects. It envelops the worker in a complex circuit of information acquisition, analysis, and transmission, constantly distributing information to the worker while incessantly gathering information about the worker. It operates on multiple spatial scales, from the microphysics of workers' body parts to commodity distribution on the continental level, to store inventories to consumers' individual shopping choices. And furthermore, physically incorporated algorithmic control of labor intensively produces the hallmark contradiction in precaritized everyday experience between continuous and discontinuous time. Meatpacking and day labor, by contrast, exhibit different constellations of technology with time and the worker's body. So modern factory-based animal slaughter and meat processing paradoxically depend on technologies that are both old and new. Meatpacking today still relies on industrial techniques of automation and de-skilling that were introduced a century ago. So workers are assigned to stationary places alongside a huge mechanical apparatus referred to as the chain that transports pieces of animal carcass around the inside of the factory. And as each piece arrives, each worker quickly makes a certain kind of cut, and ultimately plastic wrapped supermarket ready meat products emerge at the end of the assembly, or as it were, disassembly line. The knife itself, of course, is a pre-modern tool that remains central to modern meatpacking technology. And yet, information technology has enabled dramatic speed ups in the kill and processing rates, more finely gauged labor standards, and a more rapid and flexible set of responses to consumer demands across a globalizing, product-diverse market for meat commodities. And so in sum, for meat packers, technologies enmeshing with the body occurs in ways that are less comprehensive, less extractive of information, less individually controlling, and less scientifically novel than in warehouse labor. Day labor's relation to technology, in turn, reflects its historical antecedents in very low-tech manual labor, divorced from the vibrant centers of capitalism's technological innovation. Think of casual labor on the docks, hoisting ship cargoes before the advent of machine-equipped, algorithmically managed modern port systems. Or think of the lowest skilled jobs in construction or gardening, like demolishing walls, clearing away dirt and rubble, hammering nails. Day laborers thus represent a working population that is largely excluded from labor-based contact with advanced technologies. Or rather, this would appear to be the case if not for one key fact. These workers typically drift among jobs in all these sectors, working day labor gigs for a stretch of time, but then taking off for the Midwest or Southern California when they catch word that companies in meatpacking or warehousing are hiring. And thus, especially when we consider the shockingly high injury-based turnover rates in meatpacking and the contingent character of warehouse work, day laborers' job mobility symbolizes the final feature of racialized working class precarity that I want to emphasize. A distinctly racialized class experience arises through the common envelopment of workers in all these industries in a wider schema of temporal contradiction. On the one hand, this entails subjection to random disruptions over the course of an individual life as the worker shifts erratically between industry-specific regimens of embodied time and technology. While on the other hand, racialized precarity also entails confinement within a horizontal tier of the labor economy, such that even though one is always on the move, one never gets anywhere. The intensity and pressure of common predicaments of precarity in all these employment areas remain constant. Well, let me close by suggesting a couple ways to take this line of thought further that I've been considering. And I want to emphasize this as a new project. It's very much under development. I've concentrated on outlining characteristic features of racialized precarity here for working class people. But if precarity does indeed suffuse the working world at large, then what forms of racialized precarity manifest in other major domains in labor? In particular, can we discern a different constellation, a broad constellation of time, technology, and working bodies across other industries and labor processes, perhaps those that do focus on creating and transmitting knowledge, like education or software design, which mark out another distinctive racialized class formation? How would the coordinates of precaritized subjectivity for members of such a class compare to those prevalent in the working class? Might labor processes inflected by whiteness, for example, modulate embodied time's contradictions by allowing pauses for reflection and renewal, or periods of spatial and temporal remove from technology's governance, or respites from work amid ecological devastation? Might such a culture of work alleviate the harshness of desperation's clash with responsibility, even if the overall figure of desperate responsibility still defines generalized precarity? And finally, how would we characterize this knowledge or professional class's relations of difference and domination vis-a-vis the working class? Through what activities of labor, exchange, recreation, and reproduction do these social relations of oppression and interdependence materialize? And if the ensemble of relations yields not only group-specific and class-defining, but also society-wide precarity, then how might politicizing these new class relations spur challenges to precarity writ large? Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Paul, for this very thoughtful and informative talk. I think we can collect some questions or comments from the audience. So please go ahead, either raise your hand or write a message in the chat.
Thanks for letting me go a little bit over.
So as John said, I didn't even notice.
Sounded like it wouldn't be too hard to get. How do you do questions? Do you?
Yeah, either write your name in the chat or just raise your hand. Ah, yes, I see one hand. Alex Kalinikus, please go ahead.
Thanks very much, Paul, for your presentation, I was hesitating how to describe it, because in lots of ways, the experiences you describe are quite terrifying. I suppose my difficulty is, I mean, I think it's very important to reconstruct the particularity of different experiences of work, and we can think of, you know, great historical studies that have done that. E.P. Thompson in the Making the English Working Class, or Gareth Stedman Jones' Outcast London, about precisely precarious casual work in the late 19th century. But so it's great to have these accounts and these experiences. The question is, the thing that I didn't get clearly from what you said is about the larger theoretical and political context. So a question, I mean, if one's talking about class as more than just some sort of occupational hierarchy or something like that, it's a relationship. So would you like, I'd like to get some set, you know, I mean, to put it very simplistically, capitalist and worker, exploiter and exploited. Can you give us some sense of what the class relationships are here? And that then relates to the question of the political implications of what you're saying, of what you're telling us about. I mean, you talk about the individualized sense of responsibility and the, no doubt, internalized anxiety that workers in these positions have, but that if one's approaching things at all from a Marxist perspective, there has to be some sort of thought or experience, more importantly, experience of collective action that can allow those people in these kinds of positions to begin to move beyond that essentially individualized take on their situation. Can you tell us something about any collective experiences or organization? Sorry, I went on a bit, but I'll stop now.
No, thanks, Alex. Those are both central questions that I'm thinking about. My idea is that this part of the project is more descriptive and sort of showing like what would be the common themes, the common elements of working class precaritized subjectivity here. And then the question of class relations comes next. And so I think that's the crucial question to ask. And I'm interested in thinking of, I think it's politically, I think it's crucial not to just think in terms of capitalist and worker, but different large formations, different large collective entities that are in the working population, but maybe have systematically different conditions of work and of subject formation through work and work-related processes. And I think, for a long time, there have been all these disputes about, how do you handle the middle class? Is there such a thing as a middle class? Do you just talk about, a class that has a self-contradictory class position? And I think that what I'm seeing here is that especially if you're attuned to racial dynamics in processes of labor under capitalism right now, you see these ways that embodied work and embodied time relate to, first of all, are defined by these contradictions that I mentioned, but also are governed by technology in these direct, intensive, and very heteronomous ways within this particular group of occupations and in this social sector. But I think that there probably are a whole other field of inquiries that need to be done in what we might call middle-class occupations or professional work or knowledge work that I think people are rightly pointing to as undergoing its own forms of precaritization these days. I think that Albana is right in saying that there is this thing called generalized precarity, but I think that it's really important politically to understand that precarity means something a lot more specific and needs to be understood in much more specific terms than just insecurity or anxiety in a kind of broad and amorphous sense. If we're going to address the second part of your question, which is how to mobilize large groups of people, mass groups of people politically. So so I don't have an answer yet to your question about what the class relationships are, but I do think that where I want to take the inquiry is in thinking about, so a lot of people are kind of commenting about the obvious relationships that the pandemic has underscored and brought to light between, that have to do with the realm of consumption, where people who are in occupations that allow them to work at home, shelter at home, can then use online ordering to have meals and whatever they need delivered to them. But then this, of course, depends on labor within the precaritized working class. So in that realm of consumption, there's obviously a relationship of dependence and domination there, where the material well-being and security of the higher class is dependent on the lower class's exposure to heightened risks of even death. I think it's also important, though, to analyze how does the labor, like in the realm of production and labor, how is the labor of people in knowledge industries or professional kinds of work dependent on labor and shaped by labor as it appears and takes shape in the working class precaritized economy. And I haven't really thought about that or analyzed it much yet. I'm going to get the chance, though, to do this in Southern California with some colleagues at universities there and in Mexico City. So that's coming. And then just really quickly on your other point about the experiences of collective action, I don't want to talk on too much longer in response to your question, but there's a significant part of my book and my work that talks about the organizations that migrant workers have formed to respond to precarity. In particular, I'm talking about independent worker centers, urban worker centers in the most recent book. And I think the idea of trying to expand worker center organization and worker center formation throughout the precaritized working world, which would include major sectors of what are commonly thought of as middle-class workers, professional workers, knowledge workers, that I think would have great promise in terms of providing organizational scaffolding. But I think, as I was saying in the talk, I feel like talking about coalitions among a vast dispersion of social groups is not going to cut it in terms of mobilizing a sufficiently strong political force to contest these structural dynamics. So that's why it's important to think in class terms. And I can talk more about worker centers if anyone would like. Sorry.
Yes, I think it will come up again. So yeah. There are a few people who asked to intervene. So I think the first one is Lea, then we have Reese, Faust, John, Narayan, and then Yves Winter.
Great, thank you. I think this kind of develops this theme actually, and I don't know if it's a very crude question or a comment, but I guess I'm still unclear on the relationship between the precariat as a class and the working class as we have traditionally understood it. And that's really where I'd like to try and develop the argument more, or sort of see if we can think collectively about it. Because as I understand your argument, and to some extent also I read Albana books when I read her book on the precariat, it seems to me as if the argument is that there is a kind of new axis of conflict which is played along the lines of security, insecurity. And I'm not really sure that I actually share that way of seeing things, because it seems to me that if we're thinking about sort of shared condition of oppression, it seems to me that these are just different stages in the process of labor over organization. So if you have strong unions and organized labor, then you're able to put up more resistance against capital. Then you end up with maybe more protected workers and so less secure workers. So you end up with, I don't know, workers in Germany or Scandinavia or whatever. And if you have, less organized labor movements or sort of more advanced neoliberal societies or what have you, then you end up having this kind of extremely immiserated, precarious working class. But as I see it, these are both workers in a way, and there isn't really anything that sets apart the precariat workers from the protected workers of the BMW in Germany. So, and I don't know if we have a disagreement here, theoretically, on how we define what is a class a class under capitalist conditions, I guess, and what is the working class, and what makes the precariat distinctive from the working class, or if it's not distinctive, then what makes it part of it. Or if we actually agree on on just saying, look, this is just it's an empirical way of understanding a particular fraction of the working class which operates under these historically specific contingent conditions and under these political circumstances. But ultimately, there is also a kind of shared condition of oppression that they both, that these different groups around the world all share, and it has to do with, how capitalism actually operates in general. So I just wanted to check with you and see whether we agree or disagree on this.
I'm not sure, Leah. I think.
Sorry. Let's collect a few questions because I'm sure there will be overlaps, and then we can have more people intervening. Sorry for interrupting. So, Reese?
Thanks, Lucia. Yeah, sort of bouncing off of Leah's question as well as Alex's. I was really interested in your talk, Paul, when you mentioned the difference between how some of the day laborers would mention that there were some who were trying to make a 6-hour job into a 12-hour job. It reminded me a lot of some of the work that's done in studies of welfare, which will look at the way that some people are the deserving welfare recipients or the undeserving recipients of it, even though if we subscribe to universalism as a value, everyone is deserving of welfare in that regard. So I was wondering how these sort of more nuanced sort of personal responsibility ideologies play out here too as well, and to sort of touch into some of the affective dimensions that play in precarity as you've described it. And thanks again for your really fascinating talk.
Thank you. John?
Oh, thank you. And thanks, Paul, for your talk. I've got a couple of, I guess, questions that kind of roll into one. I guess the kind of first basis is, so there's, in the start of the presentation, there's a mapping of all of these authors, but there's a general lack of kind of theorization from specifically anti-racist authors who have already mapped out how class, race, racial capitalism in a sense work together, right? So I'm thinking specifically, so, Hart and Negri, I've written myself that Huey Newton prefigures quite a lot of what Hart and Negri says and understands race far better than them. So how do those theorizations map up with this? I mean, and so like the idea of, the precarious element of the working class being racialized, for example, if you go and read Ambivalent Sivanandan's work from the 80s, this is quite clear that this is what globalization does, right? That it creates a precarious migrant community that are essentially exploited in a different way, which fractures the working class across race, as the working class is dislodged in its classical form in Western economies. And we have labor arbitrage, and we have the, disarticulated Fordism. So I just wonder where that sits in this, because that in a sense kind of underpins quite a lot of what you're saying. And I've just wondered, have you kind of come across that stuff? Have you worked with that stuff? Because it's very interesting to bring it into conversation with people like Jody Dean, Hart and Negri, Guy Standing, because that hasn't actually been done very well yet at all, really. It's not been done. And then I guess the big question for me is that if you do take that, then the collective action question that I guess Alex brought up, which is, I guess is why we're all here, right? Revolution, is how does that map up with that work? So to give you an example, Sivanandan writes about, in early 2000s, writes about the Oldham Burnley protests that happened in the top of the UK, and he essentially roots it in political economy. So what we get from those northern mill towns are normally narrations of the left behind, who look like they're white ex-industrial workers. But what emerges actually in those economies are a racialized service economy, mini cabbing, restaurant working, which then underpins the left behinds, the ones who don't make the narratives, the ones who get just narrated as terrorists, right? So how does that then function? How does race really then become the linchpin for stopping collective action, right? Because these authors have then worked out that then you have to organize not separately, but in different ways to kind of come to kind of meet at the end point, which is expropriating the expropriators, right? So those would be my questions. Have you interacted much with that kind of literature?
Okay, keeping this horizon of the expropriation of the expropriators in mind, I will call Yves, and then, yes.
Thank you, and thanks, Paul, for this wonderful talk. I guess my question follows upon the ones put forward by Alex and Leah. And I was wondering, I'm coming to this from sort of the opposite direction. And I was wondering, as I was listening to your talk, Paul, whether in fact you're trying to replace the vocabulary of class with the vocabulary of precarity and racialization. So rather than trying to, actually intersect or provide an account of the racialization of class and the precaritization of the working class, whether in fact there is a sort of like a replacement of the axis of precarity versus, or precarious versus less precarious work, and whether that in fact then intersects with racialization, whether that is the project, so to speak, the theoretical project at hand.
Thank you. Paul, do you want to get back to all of that?
Sure. Thank you all for your questions. I really appreciate them. I don't know in what order to take them in. Starting with Eve. No, I don't. I'm not trying to replace the language of. I came to this because the language of class with the terms of precarity and racialization. The reason why is so the kind of logic of argument in my book is that when you look really in a careful and microscopic way at the generative themes articulated by day laborers, on the one hand, you see all the ways that this particular population is exceptionally vulnerable and largely excluded population suffers in these intense ways from precaritization that don't apply across society. And yet at the same time, when you listen to the words that they put on their experiences, they do resonate with the ways, with language concepts that various critical theorists have offered for thinking about the ways that precarity more and more seems to permeate more sectors of society. And again, my main point is, I come to this thinking always about like, how can the sort of indignities and the experiences of indignities and justice that people experience in the world of work translate into motivations for political organizing and courage to actually do so under conditions that generally are very discouraging. And I think that on the one hand, so I think that's where I find hope when you find the generalized dynamics of precarity, because it seems to indicate ways in which very large coalitions, very large forces could be brought together, rather than thinking that you always have to do it one by one organization at a time, which is what also has to happen. But at the same time, I'm not persuaded that, I'm sort of, as I was saying, said at one point in the talk, searching for a mid-range of conceptualizing collectivity, political collectivity. And I'm not sure, the other big question out there is what this has to do with party. That is not the same thing as sort of looking and saying, okay, precarity is something, it's this sort of systemic tendency of capitalism that requires a general social mobilization, but society as a whole doesn't generally mobilize. And so this is why I'm thinking in terms of class as sort of a consolidation of general contours of experience that I think do seem to resonate among multiple different terrains in the working worlds of Latinx people that I'm talking about in the United States. And I'm wondering if this is also true for other formations. So I don't, and also, frankly, I take seriously the fact that in this moment, so many popular commentators are turning to the rhetoric of class. and trying to bring it back. I mean, it's really interesting to me that in the day labor movement, that's what they're doing. So, but this does take me to Leah's question too, and I think, and also to the very end of John's comment when he said expropriating the expropriators. And Leah, you said you ended or included something about, you know, looking at the way that capitalism works creates shared conditions of oppression. And I think what I'm interested in doing is theorizing the terms of political solidarity making, which in practical terms means organizing, which I think requires more than an analysis of how capitalism works in, I mean, maybe this is just like an obvious thing to say, but I mean, I think it requires understanding the way people's subjectivities are formed in patterned ways in distinctive circumstances, not just simply saying, you know, it has to do with the fact that someone has to sell their labor for time, sell their labor time for wages in order to survive, and that this is still central to capital. If we just realize that everybody is subject to the wage, then we'll end up having, I don't know if this is what you would argue, maybe it's not at all, but it's I think that it's worthwhile trying to theorize the particular conditions of working subject formations and the ways that those, you know, can have different levels of specificity that would correspond to different prospects for political organizing of various extensivities. So, so I don't know, Leah, if, I mean, I'm not sure I would use the word precariat either. I don't really, I mean, I don't think, I think Standing's analysis is kind of all over the place and not really grounded in looking at processes of work. I think there really are, if you look at processes of work, these regular dynamics and these particular contradictions that have to do with time. This is the other part that I think, I don't know if anyone here has been doing this sort of work already, but to compare the temporal contradictions between continuity and discontinuity that I've been working with to prior formations of time in working class life, the intensification time through industrialization and mechanization, Postone's concept of superfluous time, and the idea that the more capitalism develops, the more people are working during time that where they're producing surplus value, and they become more and more aware of that, that time doesn't need to be spent working in order to produce social well-being and the goods that would nourish people. So that's, yeah, that's another direction for thought. Reese, yeah, so it is very interesting within the worker centers where I did the field research at Casa Latina and at VOS, there were definitely tensions between workers who on the one hand had a very strong emphasis on this notion of individual responsibility. And this I described as a kind of neoliberal Latinx subjectivity, where it's the idea is that the only basis of community really should be work, and everything else should be cut is just a distraction. So these worker centers are extraordinary places. They're very lively, and on the one hand, they're hiring sites that help people actually get jobs and earn wages, but they're also very deliberately community foundations for politicization, and in very sort of gradual and granular ways that are quite interesting. You know, there's a large cultural set of activities that's there, dances and cultural events and religious celebrations and funerals. They have worker self-help projects. They have volunteer activities where they go out into the neighborhoods and try to sort of enact their citizenship, even though they're, illegal by law. And they mobilize people for direct action in the communities and for policy advocacy in representative government. I mean, this is really, really diverse palette of activities. And along with that, the people who kind of get it are the ones who take that notion of individual responsibility, but sort of link it to a sense of responsibility for others, for social responsibility that they develop. And what I'm arguing in the book is that it is the organizational context that generates that passage from a very shut down, self-absorbed kind of responsibility to a more outward looking, more courageous and more social form of responsibility.
Thank you. Thanks, Paul. Well, Reese likes your answer. Yeah, you're very expressive, I see, your emoticons. Any other questions or comments? Yeah, so we have Bruno, then I will add myself. And if you want to speak, just add your name either in the chat or raise your hand, please. Go ahead, Bruno, please. Thanks.
Thanks, Lucia, and thanks, Paul, for that. Which I thought it was really fascinating research that you did, and and I'm very sympathetic to the idea what you I found it very thought-provoking what you were saying about building on the experience of migrant labour and the kind of hands-on work you did yourself. There's nearly no political theorists who do that. I thought that was really interesting. I guess building a little bit on maybe what Leah and some of the others have said, I was trying to think about what you were doing here in terms of class. And I was wondering whether there might be a difference, or trying to understand what you're trying to do, Paul, and whether you're trying to do, offering a new definition of class or a new account of what's going on in classes. So, so definitions of class, you can have kind of like standard Marxist definitions of, relationship to the means of production and labor power, or, it can be Weberian definitions of class, or professional based ones and so forth. And it could be that that's kind of what your project is arguing for, that precarity should be one of the new ways in which we define class boundaries. Or were you trying to do something more along the lines of, you think that we have a standard Marxist conception of class already, that's what defines the working class versus other class, and that's what gives us class boundaries. But then within that, we need to understand precarity and racial situation as providing a very different set of experiences and so forth. And I wondered if that perhaps was, I was interested in what you saw of more of your project offering on that, and if that maybe helps clarify some of what's going to the discussion so far.
Thank you. Well, I also have a question starting, I think, from where Bruno finished. Because, well, from my point of view, according to the classical definition of class in the Marxist sense, well, precarity is the very condition of the working class, because, of course, they're expropriated from the means of production and therefore depend on capital in order to survive. And this generates a continuous condition of precarity that doesn't affect only people on precarious contracts, but also people on permanent contract. And I think that what we have witnessed after the global economic crisis, and even now with the pandemic, is a manifestation that this precarity is an essential condition of the working class. No one is safe in capitalist society, so everyone can lose their job. And I actually think that, well, I actually couldn't understand, I must be honest with you, why you use that literature like standing and so on, because I think that it's a very divisive conceptualization of the precariat, and also quite Eurocentric conceptualization of precarity. And we have a series of studies, like, for example, Ronaldo Mank and other people who have, well, one criticized that and showed that if we adopt a global perspective, it's not true that the kind of long-term permanent contract is the kind of typical condition of the workers, because from a global south perspective, precarity has always been an essential condition of the working class. And I didn't think, well, I think all the kind of cognitive labor literature is quite Eurocentric. And yes, so on the one side, I'm really sympathetic with the idea of looking at the interrelationship between time and precarity. But I think it should be done also taking into account a kind of global perspective, especially when we look at the experience of precarious of immigrant workers, because there we have both a kind of employment precarity and a more essential precarity linked to their immigration status. So for example, I was a bit puzzled because many people I talk with, I also work on migration. When you ask, well, what the thing you want most, they would probably answer a kind of documents like a permit of stay or something like that, because there are these two dimensions interacting. So I was thinking about that too. And yeah, so how the portability and the precarity interact. And finally, about the question of working time, well, according to the Marxist view, what I would say, I mean, I think it's interesting to look at the kind of existential point of view, but it's also important to look at the working time in terms of working hours. So how the precarity of the workers impact on working hours, not just their own working hours, but more in general, how basically the precarization of immigrant workers has allowed capitalism in different societies to impose a lengthening of working hours, especially in the United States, that's quite clear, but also in Europe. And this is, I think, exactly where you can show that by making a section of the working class particularly vulnerable and precarious, there has been a general worsening of working conditions that has affected the entire working class, also people on permanent contract. And I just come out of a trade union meeting where I think that's the issue. So I think that there is this autonomous Marxism, autonomous perspective that tends to divide the problems of precarious workers and those of permanent workers. Well, what I think we should do right now, if we are to win something, is to show this is a common condition, and our working conditions are linked to the casualization of a part of workers. So we should try to link the two fights together. That's what I think.
Should I talk, or are there more questions?
Yeah. I think there aren't more questions right now. Sorry. Yeah. So you please go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah.
I totally agree with you, Lucia. So this is what I'm trying to think about, is what are the discourses that would enable this kind of linking together? What sorts of experiences, like how would it be best for people who want to organize these, this kind of bridging between the groups that you're calling precarious workers and permanent workers, to talk about the common fights that both have? I think that there's, I could be wrong, but like I think that there is there's real promising work that can be done in order to pursue this idea that it's that part of the problem is thinking in terms of this one group that's precarious and this other group that's permanent. So I'm just basically agreeing with what you're saying. And I would also agree with your point that precarity is basic to labor under capitalism in a fundamental sense. But I think then the next question is, how do you thematize that politically? How do you put that condition into discourse that has a chance of galvanizing people to become involved in political projects of social transformation? And this is where I think that this is where I think that this issue of time, and it sounds like you're thinking along those lines too, that working time, what's happening to working time, is really important. And I think the discussion is really scattered. So the one thing people are saying, so working time, yeah, you raise an excellent point. Days are lengthening. The number of hours that people have to work are lengthening. But then I think that what you meant was work for wages. But the working day is also lengthening in the sense that people have to do more and more work to get work. So what about all that labor that is counted into just finding waged employment in the first place, or just making yourself available to be hired for long stretches of time when you can just be called on to to work, but not paid at all for the time that you spend waiting. This is, illustrated by warehouse workers who are on 0-hour contracts and wait to be called in. It's emblematized by day laborers, but it's also happening in worlds of like software development and tech work. So what I'm thinking is that if we get a little more organized in the way that we're thinking about what is happening at the time, and we see that, as I was saying, there's this basic contradiction between time that assumes this kind of oppressive continuity and is never really changing, where you're always on, always ready to work, or always working, and the increasing fragmentation and disruption of time that's part of contemporary work life. And I mean work life, not just on the job, but in terms of job readiness, shifting between jobs, or dealing with the effects of increasingly dangerous work. I think that, has a chance of supplying more political spark where it's needed. So there was an awful lot that you said. I agree. I didn't mean to give the impression. I was worried that I would give the impression early on in the talk that I'm like, interacting deeply with standing or Dean or work. That was more by way of sort of introduction. Hey, there's a lot of buzz out there about class, and people are like coming up with all these ideas about it. And we should rename it the knowledge class. No, we should rename it the vectoralist, the hacker class, or something like that. I mean, I find it all kind of fascinating, but I think at the end of the day, one just has to be more specific in analysis of what's happening in contemporary labor processes, where there's sort of a willful exclusion of the complexity of those in a lot of those texts. And you're quite right to say that not only standing, but a lot of the sort of cognitive labor literature is very Eurocentric. And I think in part that's what I'm, from the perspective of someone who studies Latinx migrant work in the United States, that's what's not persuasive about arguments that like the knowledge class is is the future revolutionary class, because there are all of these very material kinds of labor, which by the way also include all kinds of knowledge that even if someone is doing work that doesn't seem like it's knowledge intensive in the sense of relying on advanced education or high technologies, there's a lot of very complex practical knowledge that has to be mobilized to do a lot of these jobs, and what I was referring to as more like material forms of labor. So I think we agree on a lot of these issues. Bruno, I'm gonna have to think about that question more. It could be that I'm trying to do both, and I'm thinking that, I don't know, I'm a little suspicious about the value of definitional exercises. So maybe I shouldn't say that I'm trying to define class differently and that that's going to be some sort of a major contribution. But possibly this also reflects my background as someone from the United States, where class is notoriously very, very fuzzy and is thrown around a lot to mean a lot of different things. People deny that there is any class in American society, or people who say that everyone is middle class. So maybe there's just a different kind of angst about, what does class even mean coming out of the US context, which is also interesting in Latin American migrant communities, where they're coming from contexts where they do have more, especially the leaders have a much more sort of sophisticated consciousness of what class means. I'm probably doing more of the second, sort of explaining more what class experiences are like, and then how, as I said, how those could motivate political transformation. I realized also, looking at my notes, that I mentioned John's last comment, but I didn't engage his questions at all. So I'm really sorry about that, John. I wasn't honestly sure about what literatures you meant specifically, because you mentioned a couple. And when I'm theorizing the racial aspects of the social and labor predicaments that I'm talking about, I'm leaning mostly on Latino scholars, Latino studies like labor studies, to talk about these forms of work, and especially the ways that the racial state in only in one sense exerts force in those communities.
Let me unmute myself. Tadiwa, do you want to turn your camera on?
Yes. Hi, can you see me? There you go.
Yes, yes. Hi.
Yeah, I was just going to ask, basically, I mean, looking at the way that the pandemic has sort of changed things, obviously it's brought a lot more conversations sort of to the forefront that we wouldn't have had before, but I think it's also kind of, I don't know, like proliferated the amount of people who count as having precarity in their lives. I think before it was quite specific in terms of, it was either really racialized or based on social class, but I think the pandemic has sort of changed that in terms of there's so many more people who had security before who no longer have it. And I was just wondering what your thoughts would be about like what the pandemic will sort of bring about in the long term for kind of work and workers.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, go ahead. Were you going to take other questions or should I answer today?
Is there any other question? Let me check the chat. No.
Okay.
Okay.
So I think what the pandemic is doing is, on the one hand, it's sort of exposing and intensifying forms of oppression that have been in existence for a long time. And to some extent, I think it's displacing attention from more embedded and endemic dynamics of domination by virtue of the, in many ways, understandable urgency of dealing with lethal dangers right here and now. I think so. For example, there is all this. If you look at meatpacking, so that's a big issue in the United States because Trump ordered meatpacking workers back to work. He ordered them to stay in the factories, even as it was being shown very obviously throughout many media inquiries that in the meatpacking plants and in the towns where meatpacking plants were located, the pandemic was advancing at horrible rates and infections and deaths were skyrocketing. And yet workers had to stay at their jobs by federal mandate. And so when people are criticizing that process, attention gets put on how dangerous meatpacking plants are in terms of the contamination risk. And there's a lot of commentary, for example, about how workers have to stand right next to each other in these factories because of the chain that I talked about and the way that workstations are laid out. And I was really shocked that there wasn't any kind of historically contextualizing analysis that said, and by the way, injuries have been at sky-high levels and it's the most dangerous industry in the country and has been for decades because of the way production is organized. And the pandemic is making these problems a lot worse and introducing new kinds of health dangers. But it was already an industry where workers, there was a normalized sense of having to go in and work in pain all the time. And there was a normalized sense that if you were ill, you still had to report to work. And now people are rightly criticizing the companies for offering workers who haven't recovered yet from COVID, requiring them to come back on the job or lose their job. So they're working sick, but people have been working sick in meatpacking for decades for these endemic reasons. So I think that the pandemic certainly provides opportunities to, say, wait a minute, these problems so we have this sort of intensified focus now, especially on occupational safety and health, hazards in the workplace to people's bodily health and well-being. People could turn that, organizations could turn that awareness towards a more historical, a more critical kind of interpretation of these problems and link them to the pandemic, use the pandemic as a launch pad for that. But that's not going to happen on its own. I think it needs to be a matter of deliberate strategy. And the other thing is that I think the pandemic can bring to light, but can also obscure and occlude the generalized forms of precarity that envelop working people more widely. So for example, bad air that's not well circulated because employers don't invest enough, whether it's public, private, what have you, they don't invest enough in good air circulation systems. And so respiratory illnesses are one of the major categories of growing occupational safety and health illnesses in recent decades, at least for the United States. And so now we have the situation in the pandemic where we're really worried about the air in offices and really worried about the air. Well, not so worried about the air in warehouses. Those workers just have to go in and suffer the bad air that is there. But you see the sort of ideological dynamic of what's happening now. It's a very individualizing approach to what's happening. You worry about the person next to you who might breathe on you and a sort of irresponsible behavior on their part, as opposed to the collective problem of what's the infrastructure of work here for all people. And that's another one of those things, getting back to what Lucia was saying before, of bridging different, mass portions of the working population, because it's office workers in WeWork and in Amazon's corporate offices in Seattle, and it's also warehouse workers outside of Los Angeles. So, so I think the pandemic, so this is my answer to your question, Tadiwa, is I think it can cut both ways and is cutting both ways currently. And it depends on organization to bring out the latent possibilities.
Well, is there any other question? If not, can I just ask on this question of organization in the United States? I mean, okay, you worked with Latinos, so there were quite big mobilizations, 2006, for example, A Day Without Us. So how did these mobilizations, or now, for example, the Black Lives Matter movement, how are they impacting on, let's say, traditional unions, right? So why aren't we seeing a kind of more sustained and broader attempt to defend working conditions in this pandemic? And do you think that there will be a revival, maybe also of labor organization sparked by these movements?
I mean, it's another really interesting aspect of if you think about day labor, meatpacking, and warehouse work. And I didn't say this in the talk, but the other thing that's in the back of my mind is that during the pandemic, these are three industries where there have been new upsurges of organizing. So warehouse workers organized small strikes. Meatpacking workers walked off the job in several plants in the Midwest when the pandemic was at its worst in those locations. And the day labor network has been at the forefront of trying to get public resources in states to go to undocumented migrants and not just citizens and legal residents. So, and it spurred new efforts in popular education, like those guidebooks that I was talking about at the beginning of the talk on occupational safety and health. So, let's see, your question was more, what was the exact question again? Was
I was thinking of, well, yeah, there is the question of also wildcat strikes in the US, which I think it's quite an important development right now. So I was wondering, the kind of Latinos mobilizations in 2006 and afterwards, and now Black Lives Matter, what kind of impact do they have on trade unions, and what kind of developments can we foresee for the future?
So I mentioned Alfonso Gonzalez, who's a labor scholar and political theorist, UC Riverside, and he's got an excellent Gramscian analysis of the 2006 movements for immigrant rights. And so one of the things that he points out that was missed largely by media and also by other political theorists who want to see the movement in more exclusively political terms, let's say thinking about Hannah Arendt and the notion of sort of appearance in public space. He's talking about the long-term processes of organizing that happen through unions, especially in California, but also New York, that made those marches possible in the first place, and it was kind of neglected. So it wasn't just a sort of momentary event. It reflected, continuing power that the movement has, even though obviously the union movement in the United States never was hugely strong compared to other countries, and has been in long-term secular decline now for decades, and organizes a very small portion of the workforce. But I do think, so this is where I think that in terms of organizing, this one project I did was about worker centers, about sort of non-traditional alt labor kinds of organizations. These worker centers are nonprofit organizations. They're organized by community groups. They're spatially organized rather than directed to particular workplaces. The prior project with the Meatpacking Workers Union was about a Teamsters union and a local union. And I think that, the future of labor, the future of the labor movement has to involve relations of cooperation and collaboration between these two different kinds of organizations. I don't think that it's going to work to just say that, well, these alt labor groups are fine as far as they go, but really we need to bring everybody within unions as traditionally conceived. But nor is it right to say, to declare the union movement dead or moribund and say that the only possible alternative is to envision lots of different kinds of heterogeneous organizations on the ground that aren't connected by any sort of a labor history or a union culture. I think there's real promise there if you look at worker centers and there's this day labor movement, the National Day Labor Organizing Network, has been able to build with mainstream unions, especially Change to Win and some of the larger US unions, even with AFL-CIO, alliances and mutual support agreements, even though initially, as you might imagine, unions were not at all happy, many of them, when worker centers were started up, because migrant workers who lacked credentials and certificates to do certain kinds of work were underbidding unionized workers in construction industries. So there's tension between those organizational forms as well, but it has evolved into more of a cooperative relationship where unions sometimes recruit through worker centers, and workers who become members of a place like Casa Latina in Seattle have the option then after a certain time to become members in the laborers union, or whether worker centers help unions do more outreach in minority communities, in Latinx and other minority communities. So yeah, that's a set of issues that I'm thinking about in that regard.
Well, thank you very much. This is really interesting. I think, Reese agrees as well, everyone. Well, you can also mute yourselves if you want, and thank Paul for his very interesting, not just the talk, but also the discussion. I think it was really great. So thanks very much, and thanks to all the participants. And well, we'll meet again in 2 weeks, actually, 2 weeks time. I don't remember exactly the date now. Do you remember, John?
The 3rd of February.
Sorry?
The 3rd of February.
Well, only the 3rd of February, so very close. And we'll have a discussion with Gargi Bhattacharya on racial capitalism. So this discussion goes on. I think, I hope you'll join us, Paul, in 2 weeks' time. And you as well, everyone, of course, is invited. We'll circulate the invite. If you want to join our mailing list and receive our updates, please email seminar Marxist Theory at gmail.com. And yeah, you'll receive a link to our mailing list to register. Yes, Trump is out.
Right.
Biden's in.
Thanks, everybody. Really appreciate the invitation. Appreciate all the comments, especially at like an early stage like this. It's really, really helpful. So I appreciate it.
Thanks so much. Okay, bye everyone.
Bye,
Have a nice evening.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.